Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Brisbane Writers Festival event. My name is Michaela Kalowski, and it's my great pleasure to be in conversation today with Colin McCann. I wanted to start by acknowledging the people, traditional owners of the land that I'm on today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and also to do a shout out to the traditional custodians of the land where the Brisbane Writers Festival are, the Yuggera and the Turrbal people. On behalf of Brisbane Writers Festival, we wanted to pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. I wanted to tell you a bit about Colin McCann before we start our conversation. He's the author of 7 novels and 3 collections of stories. He was born and raised in Dublin, Ireland, and he's been awarded a huge slew of international honours, including a National Book Award, the International Dublin Impact Prize, election to the Irish Arts Academy, the 2010 Best Foreign Novel Award in China, and also an Oscar nomination. In 2017, he was also elected to the American Academy of Arts. His work has been published in over 40 languages. He's also the co-founder of something we'll talk about today, Narrative 4. It's a non-profit global story exchange organisation. And he's also a distinguished professor of creative writing in the Masters of Fine Arts program at Hunter College in New York. And he lives in New York with his wife, Alison, and family. His latest novel, Apeirogon, was also longlisted for the Man Booker Prize. I have to say, with some books, there is a before and after, and Apeirogon is one of those books. It changes you once you've read it. The book is neither completely fact or fiction. It's this powerful fusion of the two. It's a concertina of details, of stories, of ideas, technical and historical information, and photos that all amplify and build to speak to one another throughout the novel. It tells the story of 2 real people who I'm going to get Colin to talk to us about today. A Palestinian man called Bassam Aramin and an Israeli man called Rami Elhanan. They travel the world speaking together about their daughters, each of whom was killed in tragic and senseless ways. If we have time, we will talk about a whole range of things, but we'll definitely get to talk about Narrative 4. I want to talk about the structure of this extraordinary novel. And if we even can fit it in, we might even get to Gaelic football, but you never know. I wanted to start, Colin, by saying welcome to Brisbane Writers Festival event. How are you?
I'm so good. I wish I was there. You know, if I do okay this evening, maybe I'll get a chance to come back next year with a couple of special visitors.
I think you will. I think you will. Yes. Because I think you haven't been to Australia for a good number of years, like a couple of decades maybe.
I know very well because my daughter was 1.5 years old and she's now 23. So it is 21 and a half years since I was in Australia. So it's time to go back. I always like it because I know people say, you know, there's the Irish there. There's the English sort of institutions, and then there's an American attitude. It just feels like it has a good spread of things. I like, and I have to say, I hope I'm not playing to the crowd, but I did enjoy my time enormously when I was there.
I know that we love to have you here, so we can't wait to have you back. But while we're, you know, the gratefulness of being able to have this conversation, even at a distance, let's start by talking about the 2 men I mentioned in the introduction, Rami and Bassam. How did you first hear them, and what struck you about their story? Because as we said, and we'll talk about this balance, the book is both their real story, but also it's a work of fiction.
Yeah. So, you know, over 5 years ago, almost 6 years ago, I went with Narrative 4, a group of musicians and activists, to look at, you know, whether or not we would be able to bring our work to Palestine and to Israel. And we had a trip around the country, and we went everywhere. You know, it was extraordinary. We met with Palestinian rap stars, Israeli artists, writers, people who had been involved in the army, all sorts of things. And on the second to last day, I walked into this office in Beit Jala near Jerusalem, and literally my heart got blown asunder by the stories of 2 men who sat at that table, Rami and Bassam, who, you know, frankly, they made me weep. You know, I sat there, and they. And they changed my life. And in the course of a half hour, it was one of those moments where I knew that I was experiencing something that would change my life in the course of doing it. And you don't always know those things that are going on. Rami is Israeli, Bassam is Palestinian, Rami is Jewish, Bassam is Muslim. Rami lost his daughter in 1997. Bassam lost his daughter in 2007. They came together to work together through Combatants for Peace, and then the Parents Circle, which is for bereaved parents, and they are the most extraordinary men that I have come across in basically all my years. I think of them as brothers. I think of them like fathers, cousins, sons, in whatever way. I'm tied to them because I know them very well now. And yes, it's a novel, but these men are real, and they'll come to Brisbane next year, I hope. And people will get to talk to them and see their extraordinary grace. And really what they're trying to say is that we need to know each other. And because if we don't know each other above ground, we will end up knowing each other 6 feet below ground. And that is not what we want to do. Beautiful people.
They both say throughout the book that their grief is a weapon.
Yeah.
I think in Bassam's case, he says, my grief is a weapon for peace. But in order to understand the magnitude of what you've achieved in this book, but also the magnitude of what they've achieved by being able to come together, an Israeli and a Palestinian, and speak and get other rooms of people to understand. Can you talk a bit about what happened to both of their daughters respectively, just so people know what they've lived through, what they're living through?
Their daughters, both of them say their daughters sit on their shoulders, sort of every day. The memory of their daughters sit on their shoulders every single day. I sort of inherited that feeling, and there are times when I think that Smadar's here and Apeirogon's here, and Apeirogon's here and Smadar's there, and they guide me with answering some questions about these sort of things. Because it was very difficult to talk about. Smadar was killed in a suicide bombing in the center of Jerusalem, and Apeirogon was killed with a rubber bullet in the back of her head from a very short distance. And yet, what I discovered is that Rami and Bassam, in this elegant Scheherazade moment, decided at a certain stage that they were going to tell the stories of their daughters in order to keep them alive. As you know, in 1001 Nights, Scheherazade, she tells the story in order to keep herself alive. Well, Rami and Bassam somehow tell the story of these two girls, one 14, the other 10 years old, almost 14, the other 10 years old. Amazingly, they use the stories as a weapon for peace, which is a profound, and people think, oh yeah, well that's sort of, airy, it's up there, it's kumbaya. It's not. It's so incredibly radical and powerful, especially in the Palestine and Israel of today. These are very brave people who stand, and their families, by the way, their wives, their kids, they're extraordinarily brave people.
When did you decide that you had to fictionalize them? I mean, we'll talk about Narrative 4 a little bit later today, but Narrative 4 is this organization where you work with students and you work with educators and storytellers around the world. They could have been just part of Narrative 4, but as a fiction writer, you decided to do something else with them. Why?
You know what? I think part of me doesn't know, but a part of me really does know. I'm a novelist, and I knew straight away that I was going to write a novel. And I also knew that I wanted to access parts of their imagination, parts of their history. And I wanted to do it in a way that possibly hadn't been quite done before. I wanted to push the edges of the novel. The novel is told in 1001 different cantos. It feels like a symphony that comes together. Sometimes the parts don't seem to work together, and then an echo comes in here and there. When I went to them and said, listen, Rami and Bassam, I want to write a book about you, they were like, okay, cool. And because they've had lots of things written about them. And I said, but no, I don't think you guys understand. I want to write a novel about you. I want to be inside your heads. And they said, be inside my head. Things that there's nothing that you can say that will hurt me. I've been hurt in the most extraordinary way. And all we want to do is get our message out there. If you can help us get our message out there, we will be happy. And then Rami took me on his motorbike. Bassam walked me through checkpoints. We ate together with their families. We met. We walked in the hills, and they told me things, Michaela. I mean, they told me things that they had never, ever told anyone, not even their wives and kids before. About going to war, about shooting at people, and feelings that they had on the particular day when their daughters were killed, feelings that they had for one another, and also just their own political confusion, and they were sort of extraordinarily open to me. And then when I showed them the novel, Rami read it first, and Bassam is going to read it now because it's coming out in Arabic. But when Rami read the novel, he said, "You got me on the wrong motorbike," and I was like, "Yeah, I know. I got
Let that be the biggest problem we have with this book."
But there was a reason I got him on the wrong motorbike. He drives an automatic, and he drives it super fast, and he's really aggressive driver, and he does that in the book. But I put him on a motorbike with gears because I wanted the reader to go through the idea of the word clutch and the idea of like changing gears and the movements. I used to ride a motorbike, so I wanted to get those movements going on in the book. And then there are other fictional elements. I mean, but mostly, I mean, I would say that I would be pretty happy for you to stand that book in the nonfiction shelf and or the fiction shelf. And really, for me, it doesn't really matter, because in the end, it's only about story and how story comes together and how it grinds together.
There's a lot that you reference, as you describe them beautifully. I mean, it's your book, but all the little segments or sections of the book that are numbered. And obviously you've said it, but for people who haven't read the book yet, it's a beautiful structure where the first part of the book is, there are 1001 sections, but it goes up to 500 with a section in the middle, which is the two men speaking for themselves in their own voices based on interviews you conducted with them. And then from 500 down to 1. But the way that the stories amplify as well, one of the things that kept coming up, because they both, you give them language where they talk about the experience of traveling around the world and telling their story, of retelling their story, of keeping their girls alive by telling their story. But they also both talk about the way that memory slips, that they discover new things, or that an idea suddenly occurs to them in the middle of telling a story they've told 100 times, 1,000 times, and they're kind of sliced open. What did you learn about the way that we reshape ourselves when we tell stories, and we reshape the stories as a result?
So such a beautiful way for you to put it, and all I can say is, the brain that remembers right now is not the same brain that has remembered in the past. Proteins have changed in our bodies. Neurons have fired in different ways. We can't always be true to exact memory, and the word true is very important here. But we can be honest to texture. And I don't get a chance to talk about these things. These men are telling something so deeply human, so deeply engaged, that it's, occasionally they'll get facts wrong. Guess what? Rami always talks about his daughter being 14. Maybe it's a cultural thing, but she was 2 weeks away from 14. So in my book, she was 13. For a while, Bassam used to talk about having seen the film Schindler's List. No, he did not see the film Schindler's List. He saw a documentary on the Holocaust while in prison, because Schindler's List wasn't out yet. Didn't matter. The texture of the truth is there. She's either 13 or she's 14. Or he discovered things about the Holocaust that he wasn't supposed to discover. And just to put it in context, Bassam was 17. He was sent for 7 years to prison for being in an operation where they threw dud grenades at an Israeli patrol. In prison, he watched a documentary about the Holocaust. It changed him completely. He wanted at first to see more and more Jewish people die.
It's an incredible section of the book where he's imprisoned, he's been beaten, he was a young man when he's gone in. He's still a very young man. He's living this very terrible life. And the only kind of glee for him will be to watch Memorial Day, the commemoration of the Shoah. And
Exactly.
as you write so beautifully, as he describes, I'm assuming to you, that this shiver runs down his spine when he starts to see the death. And also, as you talk about in story, that there's also a chance where that story for a Palestinian man was never believed, and he saw it and had an experience of it that made him understand that it was true.
And do you know how brave it was for him to stand up there and to say that, and how brave it is even today for him to, but for him to maintain true to his political beliefs, to be, against the occupation, for him to talk about these things. He's a mishmash and an extraordinary, collage of proper human ideas. One of the things that Rami, the Israeli, says is that for years and years and years, he did not see Palestinians as human. You know how brave it is for him to admit to that? And then he saw a woman carrying a photograph of her dead daughter, and he was completely cleaved open by the notion, and everything changed for him, because suddenly he had, I suppose, a deep and radical empathy to what it means to be someone else. And before that, he thought, well, they're Palestinians, they'll mow the lawn, or they'll fix the fridge on a Saturday, or whatever else it happened to be. And then suddenly, oh my God, everything became deeply human. And for him to stand up and say that is quite difficult, even in today's terms. And so they're very, very brave.
They are very brave. I think there's a wonderful scene that you describe where Rami and Bassam are both at one of the parent circles meetings, where I think it's Bassam who puts it into language, where he says the only thing, everyone at the table, there are Christians, there are Muslims, there are Jewish people at the table, and he says the only thing we all have in common is that at one point or another we all wanted to kill somebody we didn't know.
That's
and everyone
right.
sort of nods their head and says, yeah, but I think the power of this book is that while there is a lot in it that's about the politics, it's not about politics. It's actually about how do we get underneath that? How do we get through that? How do we stop seeing the other as an enemy, as a fearful other? And how do we start to experience some kind of commonality with them? And I think that's something that you bring out really powerfully. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about how you brought both those men to the page, because I think both Rami and Bassam are extraordinary as people, that they seem to be people who are willing to go that extra distance, willing to strike up a relationship, to strike up a rapport, and to sustain it with somebody who is very different to them. How did you kind of bring them to life on the page in a way that would be engaging for me, where I've never met them, but still truthful to them in character terms?
Can I just say that maybe this would be a time to read a short section which comes in the middle of the book.
That would be brilliant.
Because you talk about bringing them to the page, and I want, like, if I can, just have everybody to listen out for the words "you" and "me," because it actually means you, Michaela, and me, Colum, but it also means you, whoever is watching this, and Michaela, and whoever else happens to be. This is one sentence. It was a crazy sentence. It took me a long time to write. It comes in the exact middle of the book. It's section 1001, in reference to 1001 Nights. It has a mythological sort of instinct about it, but it basically gives you the summary of the book. So it'll only take 2 minutes, and stay with me and listen for the words "you" and "me." 1001. Once upon a time, and not so long ago, and not so far away, Rami Elhanan, an Israeli, a Jew, a graphic artist, husband of Nurit, father of Alik and Guy and Yigal, father too of the late Smadar, travelled on his motorbike from the suburbs of Jerusalem to the Kremazon monastery in the mainly Christian town of Beit Jala, near Bethlehem, in the Judean hills, to meet with Bassam Aramin, a Palestinian, a Muslim, a former prisoner, an activist born near Hebron, husband of Salwa, father of Arab and Arin and Muhammad and Ahmed and Iba, father too of the late Abir, 10 years old, shot dead by an unnamed Israeli border guard in East Jerusalem almost a decade after Rami's daughter Smedar, 2 weeks away from 14, was killed in the western part of the city by 3 Palestinian suicide bombers, Bashar Sawala, Youssef Shuli, and Tawfiq Yassin, from the village of Al-Asariya al-Shamaliya near Nablus in the West Bank. A place of intrigue to the listeners gathered in the red brick monastery perched on the hillside in the mountains of the beloved, by the terraced vineyard in the shadow of the wall. Having come from as far apart as Belfast and Kyushu, Paris and North Carolina, Santiago and Brooklyn, Copenhagen and Terezin, on an ordinary day at the end of October, foggy, tinged with cold, to listen to the stories of Bassam and Rami, and to find within their stories another story, a song of songs, discovering themselves, you and me, in the stone-tiled chapel where we sit for hours, eager, hopeless, buoyed, confused, cynical, complicit, silent, our memories imploding, our synapses skipping in the gathering dark, remembering while listening all of those stories that are yet to be told. And even in reading that, I just realized right now that this is the first time I have thought about this, that the book is actually the stone-tiled chapel. That's what I want the book to be, where everybody comes together and we're complicit. And we're hopeless and we're eager and we're confused. And I think the confusion is enormously important. But the big revelation, Michaela, about that section was when I wrote the words you and me. Because I actually realized that, I was narrating the novel, but I didn't really like me. And I actually don't like me all that much. I mean, I'm a pain in the ass,
We beg to differ, but okay.
Yeah, well, I don't want to write about myself. I don't think that my mind is all that interesting. But these things were firing off in my head, and then I realized, oh my gosh, it's not just me who's narrating the novel, but it's the reader of the novel herself who actually narrates it. Now, and then I thought maybe that's every single novel that's ever been written, and it could be. But for me to actually acknowledge it on the page, that's when I had that eureka moment where my head went, japers, like this, something has happened here, and this feels like the right thing to do. When I met Rami and Bassam, whatever happened was I knew I had to write about them. You know what I mean?
You've described something I was going to ask you about later on, which is the story itself is extraordinary and tragic. And many of us hadn't maybe read about it in the news or heard about it in passing. But I wondered how, and we know you're a writer of great ability and great skill and great nuance, but I wondered how you were able to transmute to us the feeling you had in that room. And you've just described it beautifully, which is finding a way for all of the readers to bring themselves, so that we build that story, we build it. And for people who haven't read it yet, and I almost want to sort of hold up the book so people can see, the book is sometimes a section is one line, and sometimes a section is, a photograph. Sometimes a section is, one sentence. It's hard to see. I'm trying to find one of the photograph sections here as well, but it's, so sometimes it's a photo. And a few words.
That's Madar when she was a baby. Yeah,
that's right. And you give us room. You give us room to find the connections between those things as they amplify. I wondered if you could talk, while we're talking about structure, if we could talk a little bit more about some of the other aspects of the book as well. That there's that narration part, which I wanted to hear you talk about, but also that in the first half of the book, there are so many extraordinary references to birds. There are descriptions of birds. There are details about birds. One of the facts that I was a bit struck by was that the migratory path over the lands that are Israel and Palestine is known as one of the bloodiest for birds
Right.
for a whole variety of reasons. There's an extraordinary passage of birds from all over the world who are crisscrossing and going everywhere. Why did you, I wondered if you knew when you sat down to write whether birds were thematically something that you wanted to bring in, because there's a lot of fantastic actual natural detail about their lives and how they're tagged and where they were kept in history. Why birds in the first half? Because the second half also then references water. Who has it,
Right.
who doesn't, who shoots whose tanks, who has a swimming pool, what land is irrigated, where you can grow certain things.
Right. Water and birds. I mean, do they know human nature? Do they know boundaries? Do they know borders? Do they care about human nature? And do they get exploited? Certainly, water. How much does it get exploited? And then these birds. Then for me, by the way, I knew nothing, zero, about ornithology before I started.
Okay.
Nothing, nothing at all. As I say in Dublin, not a sausage. It was just like not there at all. And then I started my Wikipediaing or Googling Beit Jala, where I had met these men. And then it turns out that in Beit Jala, there is this bird ringing center or bird banding center. And so when I went back the next time, I took a taxi out to the bird banding center and met all these ornithologists, and they started telling me all these like crazy things about birds. And I thought, oh my God, it's such a beautiful image, because the birds are coming from Ireland, just like me, or they're coming from Sweden, or they're coming from, West Africa or South Africa or Algeria, whatever else it happens to be. And they fly over this migratory path, which turns out to be, as you said, one of the bloodiest in the world for birds. Billions of birds every year, and then a huge amount of them die for various reasons. But also, they're very free. Do they know anything of the human dilemma underneath? And how are we equivalent to those birds? Did I know anything about the human dilemma of what it really meant to be Israeli and Palestinian, except like some vague feeling, until I met Rami and Bassam? How do we know what it feels like to be Australian and to be, sort of negotiating? We know it through song. We know it through literature. We know it through your great artists, through our journalists, through our playwrights. We know it by telling a friggin' story about this stuff. And story is the key to absolutely everything. And both these men realize that we need to tell and listen to one another's stories, because if we don't, we're isolated, we're in a box, we're going to be on that bloody migratory route that will take us down. And what we need to do is that we need to flock together somehow, and we learn from each other, and we actually take on some of the emergent patterns of nature, the emergent patterns of humanity, actually. And again, it's like this feels like things that are just like happening in my head right now. What are you doing to me? It's like the emergent patterns of humanity are really, really incredibly important. How can we work together? And guess what? Young people know this stuff. Young people who are dealing with, like, say, climate change, because it's random, it's crowdsourced, it's Greta, it's all the kids in Australia who walked out of their classroom, the kids in Ireland who walked out of their classrooms, the kids in the Bronx, wherever else it happened to be. They came together. There's an emergent pattern there that I feel is incredibly important. And I'll shut up, I'll get off my high horse right now. I do feel that contributes enormously to the possibility of decency, grace, and maybe even peace, which is, it's a big statement, and you can get ridiculed for it or humiliated for it, but I'm prepared to stand by it.
One of the most extraordinary things in this book is the notion of breaking the silence. The notion of how we find ways to break the silence, and storytelling is one of those ways. I think it's actually Rami's words where he says, we are not doomed, but we have to try to smash the forces that have an interest in keeping us silent. But it was also something else that occurred to me. I think it was one of the reviewers of your book described this book as an extraordinary act of listening. And I wondered if you could reflect a bit on both on the way that we need to listen and the way that we need to then speak up as a way to break these cycles of violence, of not knowing, and of hiding our own kind of humanity from getting to know other people, both through, whether it's through in politics, whether it's through not wanting to read things that we find confronting or that we're going to disagree with.
Right. That's great. And you know, I'm sure that there's an amazing organization in Israel called Breaking the Silence, who, you know, young soldiers who have been in the West Bank and in Gaza, who tell their stories, you know, against many of the odds. And they know that what has to happen is not just to tell a story, because after like having, say, a food in your belly and a roof over your head and maybe a companion, one of the most important human things that we have is the need to tell our story. You know, death will take a lot of things away from us, but it will never actually take away our stories. And if we can, through the great teachers that we have in our classrooms, and through really good journalists I grew up in a family of journalists. I am a journalist. You know, my father was a journalist. Through really good journalism, to continue to tell the story, you know, through the poets. I mean, the most vaulted position for me of all are the poets, but I don't think they're not necessarily more profound than the person who's writing in your local community newspaper. The fact of the matter is that we have to like tell the story, but even more profoundly, as you say, is that if we can give the person the dignity of listening to the story or becoming the story. And one of the things with Narrative 4 is we bring young people together. You step into my shoes, I step into yours. You tell my story, I say yours. I say, hi, my name is Michaela, and I was born in, you know, Australia. And you say, what do you say?
Hi, my name is Colum. I was born in Ireland in a family of journalists.
Yeah, exactly. And then we go from there. And then we go down to the diamond of the local story. Get into, like, none of these facts, figures, or anything else. I want to tell you something that might break my heart, or you might tell me something that might break your heart or break my heart, and I tell it back to you. Once we do this sort of thing, we realize how messy we are. Can you imagine doing this in say, you know, Irish schools or US schools or Australian schools, and we get kids together, and we've done it with cops, for instance, in the Bronx. Young kids and cops came together and started telling one another stories, and they began to realize, oh my word, this is so much more nuanced and so much more profound than I ever gave it credit for. And I think Rami and Bassam essentially understand that. And I think most good artists also understand this. We are our stories, and that's where our like essential democracy happens to lie, in our stories.
Can we thank you for talking about Narrative 4. I wanted to ask you about it. When was it set up, and what was the moment that really crystallized it for you, or you thought it's not just enough to do this and do it on the page the way you'd been doing it for many years? Why did you want to set up an organization? What was the kind of the ethos driving it?
It was 10 years ago. It was with this visionary, Lisa Consiglio, who's my co-founder, but there's also a whole load of artists that were involved. And I remember a day when Ishmael Bea, who's a really good friend and a co-founder, and he wrote, you know, he's a child soldier from Sierra Leone who wrote that incredible book, A Long Way Gone. And Ishmael told a story on stage with a survivor from Rwanda, and they both stepped into one of the shoes, and when it happened, something nuclear seemed to occur in everybody who was listening to it. And I tell you, it happens now every single day when we get kids from, say, you know, Mexico exchanging stories online. And that's the other thing, we can do this stuff online because we can Zoom it now. You know, with kids from Colombia telling the stories of one another. And then they realize, oh, you know, you're not just this one-dimensional thing. Part of the problem is that we've become so one-dimensional, and we all like sit in one room and one room only, and we lock ourselves off and say, don't come at me with your truth. My truth is enough. But when we are forced or asked to listen to somebody else's story and to retell it back in the first person, we suddenly think, oh, my heart is bigger, my head is bigger. And that's a young woman in the Bronx who wears a headscarf or whatever it happens to be. She's actually listening to music in the ear pods underneath it. There's so much more going on than just the headscarf.
What you see. It actually reminds me, there's a section early in Apeirogon where Rami's talking about I think he's going to visit Bassam, or he's going to one of the parent circles meetings. And he says that he's concerned that as soon as these Palestinian youths who are kind of hanging out, wearing their good jeans and hanging out near the side of the road, but as soon as they see him, they'll know who he is. And then he clarifies it. He says, no, they won't know who I am. They'll know what I am. Right. And I feel like one of the things you do very powerfully in the book is firstly, you make us aware of that, but you keep turning a what into a who. And it sounds like that's the work of narrative 4.
Oh, I'm see, this is one of those moments where you hear something and you think, that's so profound that I'm going to steal it and I'm going to mention it next time. But also, something very important about that, because your readers become the people who make your book. Your book lives only because you have good readers who are prepared to make the book bigger than what it actually even intended to be. So the who and the what, you may hear me talk about this like a few weeks from now, but I'd never even thought about it that way. And this is the way that we create these sort of multitudes. And the fact that this book will be getting read, by people who, or hopefully by people who are here on this Zoom, they will bring something to it and somehow make it bigger. That's the purpose of that's the purpose of good art, and that's how we're going to change some of the stuff that's going on around us.
You quote a beautiful writer who was killed in the book as well, called Zuwaita, who wrote the words, "To uncover, to make real, but feeling without action will shrink the heart." And I think one of the things that's really struck me about reading about narrative 4 and hearing you talk about it is that it's not only, and I don't mean just, it's not only getting young people together in the room and doing that very powerful, that active listening exercise where I hear my own story through someone else's words, but they have to really tune in. They have to not be thinking about what they're going to say next. They have to wait and really listen. But it's more than that, because there are also projects that flow on from the story exchange. Can you tell us just a little bit about some of those projects? Because I found them enormously inspiring, especially having read the book.
Yeah, well, I mean, sentiment without action is the ruin of even itself. Sentiment without action is the ruin of purpose. There has to be action at the end. Yes, we can exchange stories and we can do all these things, but unless we put that empathy or that newly discovered grace or anger or whatever it happens to be into action on the ground, then nothing's going to happen. So, for example, we're in South Africa, and we went into a township, in the Joe Slovo township, and then the kids discovered that one of the things that was a problem in their lives and in their schools and in their homes was that there was too much trash around. So how are they going to turn this trash into treasure? They decided that they were going to have a recycling center where you brought the trash in and then you exchanged it for food. But also they would turn some of that trash, like tin cans, Coke cans, into earrings and different things like this. They have begun this project. They identified this problem by telling the stories about what was going on, about people getting sick, about too much trash outside their window, all these different things. We have a project in Nablus in the West Bank. We have a project in the Bronx. We have a project in Kentucky. And people are doing things. I can't wait till we're there in Australia. A number of Australian schools have sort of like expressed an interest, and we were going to get down there, this year, but one of the things that's most important about this is it's not me who comes along and discovers anything. It will all come from the ground up. And there will be schools out there that will do things. Hop onto narrative4.com and you will see some of the things that can actually be done. And I really appreciate you giving me a chance to talk about it, because it's so close to my heart.
And it's so fused. When you read Apeirogon, you hope that there are things like Narrative 4 out in the world. And then I discovered, researching about you, that there are. And also I came across other organizations. There are other organizations in the US, for example, like the William Winter Institute, who get the descendants of slaves together with the descendants of slave owners. And there are organizations like that in Germany as well, where you have children who were of SS guards speaking to the descendants of people who survived in the same camp where that person's grandfather or great-grandfather worked. So there are these very powerful transformations that happen. But as you said, they happen not because people sit down and talk politics. They sit down and talk about where they live or where they grew up. There seems to be like there's this almost like a process of establishing trust in very small ways before they can talk about information. And I think that one of the things, it's also a moment when you were talking before about how we like to be in our boxes. But also it's in an age of social media where we feel like if we like something or we click on something, then we've acknowledged that we support it, but it's not enough. It doesn't feel like enough to us, and it doesn't. And even the act of reading something, I think the act of reading is transformative, especially when it's a work like yours. But there's more that's required of us, and I think there's something that just occurred to me now that's similar between you and Rami and Bassam, which is this is a kind of a version of radical empathy. I know you talk about that in Narrative 4 as well. But not everybody who's raised in a family of journalists is so deeply, fundamentally interested in the other. And I wondered if you could, in this moment, reflect what else was going on in the way that you were raised, or in the people who were around you, who really pushed you to really look closely at the world and to put it on paper.
I don't think there's anything special about me whatsoever. Yeah, I was lucky. Yes, I had a father who was home and my mum was there. But I think every single person, and I've seen kids come from the most shattered backgrounds, the most difficult things that you could possibly imagine, somehow vaulting away from it and refusing the cynicism and to have the ability to think that I can put myself on the line is a truly extraordinary thing. But if you give young people or any of us access to the idea that someone's going to listen to your story, they may get it wrong, and that's okay, and that you're going to tell someone else's story, and then you're going to do something that on the ground. That's when the world gets thrown off balance, and we need to be thrown off balance. I mean, this is the thing. I mean, the one thing I wanted to do with this book from the very get-go, I sort of knew that, like I'm confused. I don't know Israel and Palestine, but I'm going to get in there, and I'm going to acknowledge my own confusion, and I'm going to push the reader off the page for a little while. So the first 25 pages actually are a little bit disorienting, because you're thinking, oh my gosh, and what's this? There's birds here, there's weapons here, there's like Mitterrand, Francois Mitterrand eating his last meal here, all these different things. And then suddenly you surrender yourself to the confusion. And one of the things that I think we need to do as human beings, artists, whatever, is allow ourselves to say, guess what, Michaela, I don't know. I was going to curse, but I won't curse. I don't know. I am confused. Teach me. And for us to go in with a little humility and say, no, into another place. There's all this talk about cultural appropriation, and it's absolutely right. God bless them. They are right. When they talk about the fact that corporations, politicians, artists even have appropriated for decades, centuries, they're absolutely right. But there's also cultural celebration when you go in and you say, like you did so beautifully at the start of the hour. What was it you said? We're paying tribute to the homeland of
the traditional custodians of the land. Yeah.
the traditional custodians, and that has changed now. Then that's a relative new thing, but it's taken a couple of hundred years, or actually, well, my history might be wrong, but I know the Irish were. How many times were the Irish shipped over? When were they first shipped over to Australia?
At the very beginning, from the very beginning, always.
Yeah, but I think there is some way through stories and storytelling and decency and engagement and humility, and going in with a bowed head saying, I thank the custodians of this land for allowing me to come in and tell this story. My story is not good enough. I need to learn from you. Wow, that's how we sort of like explode the lungs of where we happen to be. That's where teachers come in as well. The teachers are amazing.
Absolutely. There's a very big debate. I mean, it's happening all over the world about who can tell whose story. And I think what seems to be coming up, at least in the conversations I hear in Australia, is that, and I think in the framework of what you're talking about, who can tell whose story is okay if the exercise is genuinely to try and stand in the feet of somebody else. But from a presentation or a representation perspective, the idea is before you tell that story, you think, have the people who've lived it had a chance to tell it first? Have the people for whom it's first-hand experience, and how can I support them telling it? And it reminds me of something that I wanted to ask you about in relation to the book, because sometimes the noise that we make around a conflict or around an issue from afar is very powerful. And sometimes the noise we make around a conflict that we're very far from, that we don't understand the day-to-day from, can be detrimental. It can be more, it can push things more into black and white. And I wondered if you were conscious of that. As you said, you sat down, you didn't know anything about the conflict. You had to sort of start from scratch. But, in the case of your experience, I mean, it feels to me as a reader that you went and met Rami and Bassam, and your experience of them changed you, and therefore it gave you something that has allowed you to change all of us who read it. But do you know what I mean about that? The distance can be a problem?
I was super conscious of it, and I was frightened. I've never been as frightened doing a book. And I lived with the homeless people in the subway tunnels of New York in the late 1990s. I have gone and visited the Romani camps in Europe. I've written about like gay Russian ballet dancers. I've written about Northern Ireland. I've done all these things. Nothing prepared me for the terror of trying to get this right. I ran it across like at least a couple of dozen Israeli readers, at least a couple of dozen Palestinian readers. Sometimes they would come to the same point and say exactly the opposite thing, which was okay by me. But one tries to be honest. I think I was honest to Rami and Bassam. And I think they are amongst the most honest people I have ever met in my life. I think they're as important as, I don't know, Aaron Dottai Roy, John Hume in Northern Ireland, Martin Luther King. What they're saying, it disturbs people in that part of the world. For us who are outside of it, it seems, oh well, that seems normal. They should and can be friends. But their bravery is one of the most astounding things that I've come across. So I tried to get it right, and I showed it to them. They didn't. They said they read it, and then they kind of always hadn't read it, but that's okay. They know who I am. We're the best of friends, and as I say, if you give us a chance to come back, oh my gosh, you'll have so much fun with Rami and Bassam. I mean, you really will.
We're almost out of time, and I want to ask you one more question. In the book, more than a few times, you quote a line that's become one of my favorite. I think both Rami and Bassam use it. Beyond right and wrong, there is a field. Meet us there. So beautiful. I wondered if you could think for us about how writing, how literature can help us find that place and stay there and dwell there.
Yeah, because beyond right and wrong, beyond the fence and the stone wall, beyond the house that supposedly owns this particular patch of land, can we stand in a field and feel the field grow around us? Is it possible to talk about the field? Coming from Ireland, where fields are incredibly important and land is incredibly, it brings up all sorts of emotions. To be able to stand in a field together beyond the notions of right and wrong, beyond the notions of good and evil, and recognize one another as standing in a field, seems to me that one of the things that, say, Seamus Heaney was asking about, all his literary life, and he was asking us to look at, the quality of the grass and to look at one another, and I believe that it's possible that literature can do this. I would pass it on to the young people who are hopefully listening here today, to be the ones to walk out of their classroom at times, to say, I'm not happy with this stuff that's going on. I need things to change, and I need a different story to be told. Let's go to a field and let's talk together. Is it possible? It's tough. But I actually do think it's possible, yeah.
I think it's a recent interview I read with you where you said, a dozen Greta Thunbergs will get a lot done, but 100,000 could completely transform the planet.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful idea. So, Colin, the book is Apeirogon. The characters are extraordinary, and there are moments where it felt almost filmic to me. I could feel Rami heading toward the valley, toward meeting Bassam. I could see Bassam stepping out of prison. Has anyone ever approached you yet with the idea of turning this into a television series or a film?
Well, that's where you guys come in. That's where actually Luke Davies, the poet, novelist, screenwriter who wrote Lion, Beautiful Boy, is in cahoots with some fella called Steven Spielberg.
Oh my goodness.
They are working together. Also, very importantly, this is really important, with the Elhanan family and the Aramin family involved. So they're working on that right now, and to me that's important, because that's part of the bird migration stuff again. Like, this idea go further and further and further and further. And so if somebody like Luke can do it, if someone like Spielberg can do it, then I think, we'll bring the story of Rami and Bassam to places that it hasn't gone before. And I'm sort of like very, I'm very, very glad, very grateful that this stuff is happening.
That's extraordinary. Colin Mccann, thank you so much for being part of this Brisbane Writers Festival event. Thank you for all your beautiful insights and for writing this extraordinary book. I can't wait for other people who haven't read it yet to read it. I almost wish I hadn't read it so I could go back and have it again for the first time. It's an extraordinarily moving.
That's a beautiful thing for you to say. Thank you for an incredible interview and for opening me up in ways that I haven't been opened up. And as I say, it's been 21, maybe it'll be 22 years now next year. That seems like way, way, way too long. So
it's definitely time for a visit.
Time for a visit.
That's right. And I'll just say thank you so much. I want to say to everyone who's watched tonight, thank you for being part of this event. Keep your eye out. There will be more Brisbane Writers Festival events that you can catch on their Instagram account and on their Facebook page and their website. But for now, keep well, everyone, and we'll see you next time.